Good morning. Beautiful location. I want to thank Zach and Alex for inviting me up here and to have a chance to talk to all of you. I hear you're having a great week of skiing. You hit the weather perfect. That's really great, and I really enjoyed just the 15 minutes I had to step outside and look at the wonderful scenery out here. I want to tell you a little bit about CureSearch, what we're doing and what you're helping us to do, because it's pretty exciting and pretty unique. I'm going to first start out by telling a story that really illustrates the challenge that we have in pediatric cancer. It's a story about Ali, and let's see if this works. Yep, there we go. Okay. So Ali was in 4th grade, 10 years old, when she was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. It's the most common cancer that we see in children. She had been feeling quite well. She loved to go to school and play basketball, and then she started having real bad back pain, strained muscles. She went to a doctor, as often the case. The doctor thought it might not be anything, that maybe was psychological, actually told her. She went back home and then continued to have really back pain to the point, bad back pain to the point she couldn't even walk. She went to the doctor again. They got some x-rays of her back, and they found out that she had multiple collapses of her vertebrae, the backbone that you have in the middle of your back. Multiple vertebrae had collapsed, and from that they made a diagnosis of acute leukemia, which can invade the bone marrow of the vertebrae, cause them to get soft and collapse just by standing up and the pressure on the vertebrae. And that's one of the presentations of this form of leukemia. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we're trying to help in that area, because Ali went on to get treatment that was developed over many years through research, got a remission, but unfortunately relapsed, and then 4 years later she died. So that was the challenge that we have to face. Why do kids still die of cancer, even though we've made great progress in their treatment, as you'll hear? So at CureSearch, our mission is to end childhood cancer by developing new approaches to moving drugs from the bench to the bedside. Our niche is to get the research that's being done at the laboratory and bring it to the bedside of patients in initial clinical trials, and then if we see something really exciting, to try to get that drug out to general use for kids, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And you'll hear in a minute about the challenges that we face in doing that, because they're quite unique in children. So here's some realities about childhood cancer. 1 in 8 children diagnosed with childhood cancer will not survive now. Now that's a big change. I have to tell you, when I started in this field in the late 1960s, almost every child died, and about 10-15% survived. I tell people that I used to spend my time preparing the parents and the child for the child's death. Now I spend a lot of time preparing the child and the family for the child's life, which is a big change. But still, 1 in 8 of these children will die, and cancer remains the #1 disease killer of children. Accidents and trauma are #1 in terms of causes, but for diseases, cancer is #1. And by the way, it is also #1 for young adults between the ages of 16 and 29. So this is a commonality that exists right through that age group as well. When we talk about cancer, we're really talking about 15 different kinds, at least 15 different kinds of cancer. This is just an illustration of the kinds of cancer that we see. And you can see that among the most common are leukemia, as I mentioned, and also brain tumors, which are one of our biggest challenge. The average age of diagnosis is 6, which is typical for these patients. Let's see if we get that to go. There we go. This is Nick, who is another example of the challenges we have. He was 6 when he developed leukemia. He was treated successfully for his leukemia, but the problem is that 60 to 70% of these patients have late effects of their treatment or may develop other complications. Some of these patients are at higher risk for second cancers, and unfortunately Nick was one of those who, when he was 15, developed a second cancer called Ewing sarcoma, which is a cancer of the bone, and he died from that cancer 4 years later. So this is another example of the challenge that we have with children with cancer. They're surviving their initial cancer, but then they have other complications later on that we're learning how to treat. We really want to have a situation where we don't have those complications once we cure them. So that's another one of our challenges. So, so with these statistics, what are we trying to do to get at this? And here's the problem we face. This is the pipeline for developing new agents for cancer. And I won't ask you to sort of look at every detail, but you can see it's fairly complicated. And there are a number of important steps along the way. And those steps can sometimes be barriers to developing drugs. It takes something like 15 years from the time that a drug is discovered in the laboratory till it eventually gets out in clinical trial and turns out maybe to be useful. And then there's more time to get it commercialized. This is way too long. And particularly for children, it's a huge challenge. So let's see if we can, I don't know if this will work, but let's see if we have you can see the various steps along the way here. Now, our CureSearch's approach is to choose grants that are designed to take drugs from the bench to the bedside, to bring them to children. You can see these names that you see on there, the doctors' names. Those are the grants, the major, what we call grand challenge grants we're supporting, and this is where in the pipeline those people are researching. And you can see it's further along in the pipeline. And most of them are further along in the later stages where we want to get them from the bench to the bedside, and that's our niche. That's what we're trying to do. So the problem that we face is the following: a drug gets to clinical trial in children. It may be tested, it may not be, because the drug company that has the drug or the investigators that have the drug are mainly usually interested in adult use, and that's because the market is so much larger. So very often we can even have a drug that looks active, but it doesn't get tested in children. The second problem is it can get tested initially, and we can find out that, yes, we have a dose and it's tolerated, but the drug company may decide we don't want to go any further because we're afraid that we're going to have side effects that could mean the drug might not be able to be used in adults, and we want to mainly use it in adults, and so there's the market issue, the small market issue of children. And the third thing is there are very few children available compared to adults to do these studies to find out if the drug is going to work. And so all in all, this causes a major problem. Our approach is to really propel these drugs through clinical trials into use in children. We don't just fund the research. We try to get those drugs into clinical trials, and I'll tell you in a moment one way we try to do that. We have a scientific advisory council which is made up of the top pediatric oncologists in the country. The chairman is the head of pediatric oncology at Sloan Kettering. We have the head of pediatric oncology at Dana-Farber at Harvard on our committee. We have representatives from all over the country, and even a major pediatric cancer researcher who happens to be in the brain tumor area from London, England, used to be at St. Jude's. So our Scientific Advisory Council reviews all of our grants, and they're the ones who recommend which ones we can fund. We also try to provide these grants over 3 years, but we do something unique. Most granting agencies, when they give you a grant, they say, okay, here's a grant for 3 years. Do the studies, let us know how you're doing. At the end of 3 years, we'll decide whether we want to continue to fund you. We don't do that. We ask them at the outset for milestones. Tell us what you're going to accomplish at every point in time along those 3 years. If you don't meet your milestones, we won't continue the money. We'll tell you, come back to us when you meet your milestones, then we'll give you next year's money. So we really hold the researchers accountable, hold their feet to the fire to make sure that they move that stuff along. And if they run into a problem, we want to make sure they solve that problem before we move on with the funding. And that's really important because we don't want to find ourselves 3 years later having funded the grants and not gotten where we wanted and where they said they were going to get to. So that's another differentiating factor. That accountability is shown on this first point here. We also build long-term partnerships with our researchers so that if their drug really turns out to be interesting, or in one case we're going to be doing research on new markers for cancer, new ways of detecting cancer early, if those things are useful, we want to help them get that out into general use. We don't want to just stop and say, okay, you were successful, your research was fine, but it's not going to help anybody until it gets out to all kids. And so we try to help them, and we're starting a new fund to do that, a $10 million fund called the Catapult Fund, which is designed to provide money to get those drugs, once they've been tested, to get them out into commercial use in conjunction with the pharmaceutical industry. Because remember, I told you that the pharmaceutical industry is not terribly interested in moving drugs into children because of the small market and the risks that are inherent in treating children. And so we need to partner with them. This came out of a major study by the Institute of Medicine in Washington a few years ago that I was part of. We need to partner with them to get them to move these kids into children. It's fine, they'll go into adults. That's no problem because there's a lot of adults and they're anxious to do that. But we want them into children. And so that's what our goal is, to move these drugs quickly into children and to remove this barrier that has kept the drugs from getting into children and being in the valley of death, as we like to call it. That's the name we give to the drugs that get to a certain point in clinical development and then stop. We just had a meeting of all the drug company representatives, the FDA, ourselves, cancer researchers, a closed meeting to talk about this. And we were told by the pharmaceutical industry that they have hundreds, if not thousands, of compounds on their shelves that they have decided not to move forward with because of considerations I just talked to you about, or they didn't seem to be active in adults, but they might be active in kids. And they were asking us, how can you help us move those into kids? And part of that help is partnering with them to make this possible, because the financial burden to do that is pretty large. And the market, as I said, is small, so we need to help them do that so those drugs get out into kids. And that's what we're about to do. So I'm going to move ahead here. So there we go. So this is really the nexus. This is really our strategy that you can see here. And this came out of that Institute of Medicine meeting I told you about. Basically, we had a bunch of experts, including representatives of parents of kids with cancer, advocacy organizations, scientists, FDA, NIH, etc., that was held in Washington about 10 years ago. They came out with this conclusion, that the only way to move drugs into kids with cancer, because of the issues I mentioned, is to get all of the partners, all the stakeholders involved in this together to try to make it happen, because it will not happen by one alone like it does for adults, drug industry, or NIH, etc. You need everybody coming together and trying to make this happen. So CureSearch is trying to be the facilitator to make this whole partnership occur and everybody focus on the common goal of getting those drugs into kids. And that's a unique partnership. No one else is doing this. None of the other organizations funding childhood cancer research are doing this. They're funding grants. There's some great programs out there funding grants, but they're not trying to do this, to bring the investigators together, the government, the industry, etc., and get those drugs out there, because that's the only way it's actually going to help. The research can be great, but if it never gets to anybody, it's not going to help. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about what you all are doing. One of the things that your Love Your Melon is helping us do is to fund this particular grant in of all things, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Now, even though we made great progress with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and most of them are called so-called B-cell precursor ALL, and that's what BCP means here. Even though we've made great progress, because it's the most common cancer and because still 10 to 15% of these children die, it is the most common cause of death in childhood cancer, the second being brain tumors. So we're trying to attack the most common cause, the relapses, and you're funding a grant at Stanford by Carla Harris. And what she is doing, Carla Davis rather, and what she is doing is taking advantage of one of the most exciting developments in cancer research right now, which I think you probably have read about in the press a lot, and that is the ability to basically dissect the genes of a cancer cell. You can do it even on a single cancer cell, figure out all the genes that are present, figure out ones that may be important in why the cancer develops, that drive the cancer, that are the machinery that drives the cancer cell, and try to develop drugs or agents that attack that specific machinery and don't damage the normal machinery of the cell, of normal cells, because that's where your side effects come from, damaging the normal cells. So this is what's known as targeted or precision therapy. She is using that information about relapsed cancer patients, relapsed leukemia patients, to figure out drugs that interrupt what we call the signaling pathway that signals a cancer cell to grow, in this case, the B-cell leukemias. And by figuring out a specific target and why these cells become resistant, and she has figured out some of those signaling changes, she can then target drugs to those signals and hopefully kill these cells that have become resistant to the effective therapy that's developed for most kids with acute leukemia. And you are helping to make that possible, and that effort, and this is a picture of some of the research that she's doing in the lab, if that's possible, we'll be able to develop a drug that then can be used specifically for these children with BCP leukemia. She's figured out the phenotypes, and I'll show a little diagram of that here. She's figured out the phenotypes of leukemia cells. That's the gene signatures of leukemia cells that are important in relapse, and then targeting drugs for those signatures. So this research is progressing very nicely. We're really excited with her work. We're hoping that if it works out successfully, then we will be able to move on to the next step, which is clinical trials. And then if that works out, to the next step of getting this drug out to kids with relapsed leukemia, and hopefully changing the paradigm for those 15% that don't survive, like the patients I mentioned. Now, before I finish, I want to tell you just a story that I think illustrates what the potential here is, why we're doing this. A lot of these patients who survive go on to normal lives. And I'll tell you a story of one. It happens to be a young adult because I take care of both children and young adults. And this was a young man, Jason, who, when I first met him, he was at Stanford in a program of bachelor's and master's degree together. Very bright guy, bachelor's and master's together in business, and he was in his first year of college, and he developed a major tumor called Ewing sarcoma of the pelvis, which is the worst bone to get this tumor because it's very hard to treat. It gets to be very large, very hard to treat. He came to me after researching, this was now probably 15 years ago, 10 years ago. He came to me after researching the internet. I remember he came in with a pile of abstracts, medical abstracts he had copied off the computer, and because he was ready to talk seriously about his treatment, and he knew there were some alternatives, he knew there was controversy, and so he grilled me for about an hour about these differences. And he had already done that with about 5 other pediatric oncologists around the country, including at Stanford. And we went through all that, and he decided that he wanted to be treated with me, and he decided on one of the alternatives, which was one of the alternatives I would have recommended to go with. And so we went with that. The story about him is that he had to have half of his pelvis removed to get rid of the tumor, in addition to the chemotherapy he got, continued at Stanford, was learning to fly a plane solo 3 months after he had half his pelvis removed, because we were able to preserve his leg and create a new joint inside with the rest of his pelvis. So he never had to have his leg amputated. He was able to continue that. He ended up finishing his therapy successfully, has not had a recurrence now 10 to 15 years later. He is an entrepreneur. He's the kind of guy who goes in, becomes a CEO of a company, turns it around, sell the company, that kind of a person. He's married, has 3 kids, all absolutely fine, perfectly fine, despite having a lot of chemotherapy. It's an example of what the goal that we have here is. Even though these kids need to go through terrible treatments, difficult treatments, because they're young, they're able to come out and survive, and many of them go on to lead normal, productive lives. That's what we're trying to do with our research, and to do that, your help has been critical to us, will continue to be critical to us. I was very pleased that you all finished the initial commitment you made to us. We're very, very pleased with that. It allowed us to continue this research. We're hoping to continue with you in the future in our efforts to get these drugs into children, and hopefully be able to tell you some success stories like the one I just mentioned, but success stories for the children that we're not yet successfully treating in the future, and hopefully maybe have one or more of those kids come to meet with you at one of your future meetings and tell you for themselves what it's meant to have this research done, because their lives actually depend on this research. You are giving them the hope that they need in order to survive, and many of them survive because of the research you're doing.